Thank you. The final item of business is a members' business debate on motion 18859 in the name of James Dornan on financial abuse to be recognised fully as coercive and controlling behaviour. And this debate will be concluded without any question being put. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on James Dornan to open the debate. Mr Dornan, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I start off by thanking everybody who signed my motion and those who have stayed behind for tonight's debate. Presiding Officer, financial abuse is an aspect of coercive control, a pattern of controlling, threatening and degrading behaviour that restricts a victim's freedom. It's important to understand that financial abuse seldom happens in isolation. In most cases, perpetrators use other abusive behaviours to threaten and reinforce the financial abuse. And here are just a few facts about financial abuse. You're 5 times more likely to experience physical abuse if you're experiencing financial abuse. The increased risk of domestic homicide if you're a victim of financial abuse is greater. Lack of money and financial resources are the main reasons women return to an abusive partner post-separation. And economic barriers and a lack of financial independence is the main factor for women staying longer in an abusive relationship. 2 months ago, I held a roundtable discussion on the impact of financial abuse of women. And in all the work I've done in partnership with women's charities, this is probably the most eye-opening meeting of how deeply rooted and systemic the coercive control of women can be. Presiding Officer, I had a fantastic speech all prepared for tonight's debate. However, I received a briefing that I had requested from the DAISY project, and once I read that, I thought, no point in me telling you what my view is of this, and it's better that you hear the words of the women themselves who have been going through this. So here is an opening explanation by the DAISY project, a women's charity, support charity in my constituency. This is a type of abuse which in our experience includes identity theft, having money or other property stolen, being defrauded, being put under pressure in relation to money or other property, and having money or other property misused or withheld. Financial abuse is often viewed as an unacceptable but inevitable reality for the women we support. Societally, there has been a very high tolerance of women being left to cope with enormous financial pressures, both during the relationship and after they leave, in particular when they're bringing up their children. A primary focus on the work of DAISY is often risk assessment, safety planning and supporting women to rebuild their lives safely. Unfortunately, this has led to financial abuse being identified but rarely addressed by any of the agencies. We are working with women and in discussion with the police to explore the best way to address this persistent, long-term form of abuse and control over women. Women report to us that it's massively impacted on their quality of life, freedom of choice, and leads them to feel degraded, distressed and hopeless. It's recognised that perpetrators of this type of abuse are often well versed in avoiding detection and being brought to justice, and that a major aspect of their technique is in relying on other agencies such as the police, social work, DWP and court processes to further the abuse. Now, following the roundtable discussion that I mentioned earlier, 6 women from DAISY met to explore and document some of the ways that the perpetrators have used financial abuse to their detriment. And I ask you to listen for yourself at just how insidious and long-lasting the damage can be from this form of abusive behaviour. It was found that in each case, the financial abuse had continued long after the relationship ended. One woman shared that the perpetrator would lend her money to pay for family grocery shopping and that she was always in debt to him for providing essential household items. He took control of all the finances and was always aware of her salary, and it was common for him to be the main claimant in benefit claims, car finance and mortgages. It was agreed it was subtle to begin with. It took a long time for the woman to realise what was happening. They reported money for holidays, family funerals and even children's savings being squandered and misused for the perpetrator's own enjoyment. That perpetrators obtained details of internet banking passwords, credit cards, bank accounts and used them fraudulently during the relationship and after it had ended. One woman discovered 14 online credit accounts in her name once the relationship ended, and she's still paying them off 6 years later. In most cases, child maintenance wasn't paid appropriately, and in several cases, arrears were written off, meaning a loss of thousands of pounds for some women. They often had full access to legal aid and represent themselves and use the court process to incur extortionate costs for the woman to defend, many of whom work and only have access to partial legal aid. One of the very concerning feelings that came to light through this meeting was that very often agencies enable the perpetrator to further abuse when he abdicates all responsibility for the debt he has built up. Of course I will.
Linda Fabiani.
Thank you very much for giving way. I wonder, Presiding Officer, if Mr Dornan or anyone else here has had constituents come to them with the same issue as I have, which is that even after a case has been to court and domestic abuse proven, in order to close a joint bank account, the woman has had to go to the bank with her partner, former partner or husband in order to close that account. And the damage that can cause psychologically is immense.
James Dornan.
I couldn't agree more with what my colleague has said there. And that just highlights the problems that we have when we're dealing with organisations and agencies. That they're looking for in many cases, they're looking to stick to the rules, or they're looking for the easy way out to get the money. There'll be examples here, for example. He ran up council tax arrears when he was in control of the finances, and the council have now allocated the whole amount to me as it's my address. Income support loans were taken out by him, but tied to both insurance numbers and a joint claim. They've now been allocated to me. DWP have allocated it all to me because it was a joint claim. He no longer claims benefits, therefore it comes to me. Court systems are used to further the abuse. He refused to sign the paperwork for a year, deliberately did this knowing I would be stuck in limbo and that this was putting me under financial pressure. So there's a number of things. Trust deeds, he signed a trust deed for £30,000, doesn't pay for it, it's in her name. I could go on and on. But I'd like to finish with a case study which encompasses many of the issues women face when trying to overcome coercive control. Sarah was married outside the UK to her British husband. He decided to go back to the UK and do her visa paperwork to call her to the UK where they would settle and raise a family. She had a new baby when her visa came through, but it was only for her. But the perpetrator convinced her to come over and leave her new baby with her mum for a few weeks until her daughter's paperwork was completed. Otherwise, her visa would expire. Sarah's husband separated her from her child for 4 years. She had no money to fly back home to get her daughter or pay to apply to bring her daughter to the UK. Once her daughter was in the UK, she was given no money to buy toys or clothes for her child. For 5 years, she had the same clothes she came into the UK with, no money for any winter jackets or appropriate clothing to deal with Scottish weather. She'd never seen Glasgow city centre because she was always kept in the house and had no money to travel, had never gone for dinner, cinemas or allowed to shop alone at any supermarkets, had no bank account and all the child benefit was paid to him. And unfortunately for Sarah, when social work were involved in her case due to some issues around her child's care, they didn't see any of the conservative, coercive control or financial abuse she was suffering and was seen as being an unfit mum for not providing adequately for her child. So where were the warning signs? Why did Sarah not have a bank account? She didn't know the way to her child's school, which was a clear sign of severe isolation. She would often have no jacket or summer shoes on in winter when she had a social work meeting. And why did she take 4 years to bring her child to the UK? Again, no financial abuse was detected, and she was classed as the unfit and uncaring mother. Presiding Officer, these powerful words from women, many of whom I know and I'm close to, show that despite the ongoing good work by the Scottish Government and prosecutorial services, there is much, much more to be done. And for the sake of these women and many more, it's time that society recognise just how damaging financial coercive control can be for the brave women and children who are innocent victims of uncaring men. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Margaret Mitchell, to be followed by Rona Mackay. Ms Mitchell.
I congratulate James Dornan on bringing this important and timely debate to the Chamber this evening. Domestic abuse manifests itself in many forms, and not all victims and survivors of domestic abuse bear the physical wounds and scars of their abuse. Today's motion recognises the Domestic Abuse Act 2018 criminalises coercive and controlling behaviour. While less tangible in nature, this nonetheless involves a pattern of behaviour which can result in deep emotional and psychological scars, which persist long after the physical ones have healed. The motion focuses on financial abuse as largely invisible and a particularly hideous aspect of domestic abuse, where the abuser uses financial dependency to control the victim's life. And it notes and calls for financial institutions to use best practice rules in their dealings with vulnerable women who have suffered financial abuse. Here I want to raise awareness about and to congratulate the Royal Bank of Scotland on its initiative to partner with the UK charity Safe Lives, which is dedicated to completely eradicating domestic abuse. Through this initiative, the charity will consult on RBS policies, procedures and services to ensure the bank is providing the best possible support to those affected by financial abuse. Working with the charity Surviving Economic Abuse, Save Lives has created a bespoke training package for specialist teams within RBS. This training teaches staff how to spot financial abuse and how to provide appropriate help, both of which are challenging yet crucial aspects of this training. In addition to this, RBS has appointed a financial abuse specialist in the customer protection team who is available for appointments and supports customers on an individual basis to fully understand their situation and support their needs. This partnership has allowed RBS to build on their existing support service with practical measures such as providing new secure cards, PIN codes, online banking, mobile app access, as well as the ability to open a new account with a different national sort code. In recognition of the fact that reporting financial abuse can be, to say the least, challenging, the bank will develop a specific online form. This will allow customers to contact the bank on their own terms. It also offers secure video banking appointments with specialist bank staff to facilitate face-to-face conversations and discussions about options available. Deputy Presiding Officer, the RBS initiative provides a model which other financial constitutions could copy in a concerted effort to tackle the invisible and hidden nature of financial abuse, which can have such devastating impact. Over the festive period, traditionally, incidents of reporting of domestic abuse tend to increase. It's also the case that most people have additional financial pressures, which in turn can only add to the vulnerability of those who are subject to financial abuse. As such, I hope more financial institutions will take similar positive steps to the ones already outlined to help identify and tackle financial abuse. And I again thank James Dornan for providing the opportunity, especially at this time of year, to raise awareness about this type of controlling coercive abuse.
Thank you very much. I call Rona Mackay to be followed by James Kelly. Ms Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank my colleague James Dornan for bringing this important debate to the Chamber. It's right that we highlight this all too common form of abuse. Presiding Officer, the days of recognising domestic abuse as bruises and cuts are over, although physical abuse is still happening at horrific levels. But we now know that abuse takes many forms, and with the new Domestic Abuse Scotland Bill, which for the first time recognises coercive abuse, it's illegal to carry out a pattern of behaviour which damages the mental well-being of primarily women. So what is financial abuse? Financial abuse is about power and control. It's about withholding finances to curb the liberty of a partner, to disrespect them, to humiliate them, and to essentially deprive them of their human right to exist without permission. Presiding Officer, I remember when I was in my teens, my mum telling me of her shock when a friend from a well-off background asked her for money to buy a pair of tights because her husband wouldn't give her any money to buy some. My mum was horrified, and so was I, but at the time I didn't recognise it as coercive control or financial abuse. I just realised that it was a horrendous way for one human being to treat another. Women's Aid Domestic Abuse Report 2019, The Economics of Abuse, revealed that nearly a third of domestic abuse survivors said their access to money during the relationship was controlled by the perpetrator. A quarter of respondents said that their partner didn't let them have money for essentials during the relationship. This poses an increased risk for the survivor. Economic barriers to leaving can result in women staying with abusive men for longer and experiencing greater danger, injuries and even homicide as a result. And of course, financial abuse impacts heavily on children. One of the most basic parental instincts is to provide for your child, to be able to make them happy, to give them what they need. By depriving women of money or control of money, perpetrators are also therefore abusing their children. They're denying their partner the right to provide for them, which can psychologically damage the relationship between mother and child, coercing the child into thinking the father cares more for them if he buys them things. Presiding Officer, it's a horrible way to behave at any time, but at this time of year, just before Christmas, the pressure and pain leading to feelings of guilt must be even worse. But financial abuse takes many forms. It may be fraud, obtaining power of attorney by coercion. Elder financial abuse is sadly all too common. Non-payment of bills without disclosing to the partner, withholding child maintenance payments, or racking up huge debts without thought of the damage it will do to the family. All of these things makes life intolerable for the victims. Of course, our wonderful third sector organisations such as Women's Aid, Relate, many business organisations and even banks offer advice, as Margaret Mitchell was outlining, and support on how to deal with and protect yourself from financial abuse. Although Linda Fabiani's point about the woman having to go to the bank to close the account is an excellent point and something that the banks must really take on board. But I think the message from today's debate should be recognise if you are being financially abused, seek help and support from the many organisations out there, and know that you're not alone. We should all call out this despicable, controlling behaviour at every opportunity and continue to raise public awareness of this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call James Kelly to be followed by Gillian Martin. Mr Kelly, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'd like to congratulate James Dornan in securing this important debate, and by the contributions that we've already had from members, it's bringing a very important issue to the Chamber this evening, revealing some of the really difficult and unacceptable circumstances that women have to live in because of financial abuse. I think, as the motion notes, the Domestic Abuse Scotland Bill plays a very important role in terms of bringing people to justice who commit these scandalous acts of domestic abuse against women in Scotland. And what the Act does is it goes further than physical abuse. It makes controlling behaviour, making women suffer emotional or psychological trauma also a crime. And I think that's very important because in some relationships, that's the way some men behave towards women, and it's right that that should be captured in law and people should be brought to justice as a result of it. What this debate focuses on is the issue of trying to widen that out and cover financial abuse and the way that in some relationships, mainly men, use their position and use their finances to deny women access to finance and make their lives a misery as a result. If I could perhaps give an example of a constituent in Glasgow that's been in touch to demonstrate the issue. This constituent was married. However, in terms of the setup in their home, the household wasn't owned jointly. The man kept it singly owned. He earned £150,000 a year, but he didn't give his wife any proper access to cash, and she was therefore, required to kind of fund groceries, clothes for her children, and half of household items through either money that he chose to hand down to her as sort of pocket money, if you like, or savings. Eventually, this woman left the relationship, and she has had a great deal of difficulty in the courts seeking appropriate compensation. Indeed, she has endured £55,000 in legal fees trying to take her case through the courts. And I think one of the issues that's been highlighted in this particular case is that in courts, the courts in Scotland can only award 3 years financial compensation post-divorce. So I think there are a number of important issues that are highlighted by this debate and the case that I've spoken about this evening. I think moving forward, it's important that the Domestic Abuse Scotland Act the provisions within that can be explored as full as possible to ensure that financial abuse is covered and that people who commit financial abuse are captured under this Act. And I think appropriate work from Police Scotland to do this should be taken out. I think the point that others have made about the banks and the financial institutions is an important one. The example that Linda Fabiani quoted about the having to go to the bank together to resolve the signature issue is obviously totally unacceptable. So I think this is an important debate that James Dornan has brought forward this evening. It perhaps identifies that there are maybe some gaps in the law. There are also some actions that financial institutions and Police Scotland can take into account. So I'll be interested to hear the Minister's response to that.
Thank you very much. I call Gillian Martin, followed by Maurice Corrie. Mr Corrie is the last speaker in the open debate. Ms Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and congratulations to James Dornan in securing a really important debate on an issue that's often an unseen one. I want to thank James Dornan for allowing us to have the opportunity to talk about this issue, because financial abuse affects some of the most vulnerable and isolated victims of domestic abuse in Scotland. And for many victims, this kind of abuse physically acts as a barrier to leaving their abuser, as many of us have already said in this debate. It can leave victims with no money for very basic essentials such as food and clothing. It could leave them without access to their own bank accounts. They might be earning their own salaries, but they don't have access to them. They might not even have access to a mobile phone, and they're cut off from their family and friends because that account is paid for and controlled by their abusive partner. And with no access to any independent income, and with debts perhaps that have been built up by abusive partners, often set against their names, or fraud that has been committed in their name can leave a lasting negative legacy, even once a relationship has ended. So even when a survivor has left the home, financial control can still be exerted by the abuser, perhaps regarding child maintenance or putting them under financial strain through any kind of protracted legal disputes. I've certainly had a couple of constituents who have come to me and they have just been beyond access to legal aid, because perhaps they've got their own job, so on paper they're earning a salary, but they're battling with an abusive, controlling partner who's been able to throw considerable amounts of their wealth at solicitors to extend their control beyond the point where the woman has walked out the door over things such as custody or access to the sharing of assets. One issue that I want to mention is back in 2014, when I first started campaigning for access to period products for women that didn't have enough money to buy them. I went and I did that under Women for Independence before I actually became elected. I went into the Cyrenians in Aberdeen to do a wee bit more research on this, and I was completely and utterly gobsmacked by a discussion that I had with a domestic abuse officer, who told me that it was not just an issue that affected those in poverty, but also in those in abusive relationships. Many women shared their experience of having money withheld from them, which meant they couldn't get access to sanitary products. And one woman I spoke to who was victims of financial abuse, she told me that how controlling, threatening, degrading behaviour left them so vulnerable, but also left them very isolated, because without access to money to have the most basic of period products, she couldn't even leave the house. And so her actual movement was controlled for a week every month. I mean, Scotland is leading the world in tackling gender inequality and reducing the stigma of periods by increasing the availability of free period products. I've long argued that actually it shouldn't be based on any kind of income because of this. And I've heard horrific stories of how women would be physically punished if they bought any items for themselves. Of any kind of personal nature. They might be given small amounts of money if they behaved in a certain way, or even agreed to do certain sexual acts and having payment for sanitary products. Personally, I think we could be doing more to give abused women access to legal aid. I've said financial control can be exerted even if a woman has her own salary. The man's particularly aggressive and in a vengeful frame of mind and has access to significant funds. He could drive a woman into penury by having to undergo legal processes over assets and access to children. Before I sit down, I must say one thing, that I welcome the fact that the legal profession and the judiciary is looking at having better training for sheriffs that actually understanding these issues as they make judgments, particularly around things like custody and the division of assets.
Thank you. Colmores Corrie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I would like to thank James Dornan too for bringing this very important member's business to the Chamber this evening. An enduring misconception we see today is that domestic abuse implies only physical abuse. We know this is not the case, and domestic abuse spans physical, sexual, verbal and psychological abuse, as well as what we are here to discuss today, which is financial abuse. This can happen to anyone, and often in the subtlest of ways, frequently undetectable by those on the outside, and indeed we need to remember that the wider domestic abuse affects a range of people, ages and ethnic groups. When it comes to domestic abuse, there are strong and complex links between physical health, well-being and financial security. A threat to any of these tends to be a threat to all. Financial or economic abuse can encompass many things, but at its root is the misuse of money. For example, perpetrators can gamble away family finances, use victims' credit cards against them, or commit to financial contracts in their name. It can mean limited opportunities when it comes to education or employment, or a restricted access to essentials such as food, clothing and transport. For example, one survey conducted by Women's Aid has shown that over 70% of respondents were forced to live without essentials. The coercive nature of financial abuse is evident, and by definition, coercive control is a pattern of controlling, demeaning and threatening behaviour which confines a victim's freedom. The consequences of financial economic abuse are far-reaching and for many victims seemingly insurmountable. And first, there are practical consequences. Women can be left with sizable debts in their own name accrued by their partners. They might be left without access to their own bank accounts, as we mentioned already, or any option of an independent income. Many still have to worry about the practicalities of child maintenance, even after leaving their partners. But the impact of this abuse also takes on a deeper and more emotional toll. For instance, I have read personal accounts detailing feelings of isolation and fear. For many women, a limited access to their finances can stop them from leaving their abuser, or if they feel they are left with no choice, leading to an increased risk of continued abuse. Many feel they are unable to rebuild their lives in the face of financial instability, effectively removing their independence. And the Domestic Abuse Act, Scotland Act of 2018, seeks to address the gap in our law, where psychological abuse in a relationship had previously not been taken into account as an offence. By including it as a new offence under this Act, as has been discussed, Parliament rightly recognised that the domestic abuse cases should not only centre on one single incident of threatening behaviour or physical abuse. Rather, we need to remember that the criminal offence should consider the course of conduct over time, encapsulating both physical and psychological abuse. The sobering evidence included in the Justice Committee Stage 1 report highlighted how financial abuse is most definitely part of psychological abuse. And testimonies spoke of victims who were forced into economic dependency on their perpetrator. And by criminalising the coercive and controlling behaviours of offenders, this Act was established a single offence covering psychological, sexual and financial abuse, which carries a maximum 14-year sentence. However, Deputy Presiding Officer, to conclude, I do understand the desire and need for further clarity surrounding the inclusion of financial abuse in the Act's formal definition. It is, of course, so important to be as clear as possible to ensure that protections against financial abuse are reflected not only in our legislation, but also in our responses to and understanding of this form of abuse. And as a Parliament, it is vital we do all we can to ensure that the coercive nature of financial abuse should not be in any way minimalised. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Corrie. I call on Ash Denham to close to the Government Minister, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin, as others have this evening, by congratulating James Dornan on securing this debate on this important subject. And I think his speech drew out particularly the link between financial abuse and violence, and also illustrated very well with some of the examples that he used just how serious this is. So, of course, last year this Parliament came together to pass groundbreaking new domestic abuse laws, including the creation of a new offence which covers not only physical abuse but forms of psychological abuse and coercive and controlling behaviour that were previously very difficult to prosecute. And financial abuse, be it controlling a partner's access to money, running up debts in their name, or preventing them from being able to earn money, which is many of the things that we've heard through members' speeches this evening, is one of the many forms that domestic abuse can take. And last year, the Parliament passed the Domestic Abuse Act, which makes it easier to prosecute these non-physical types of domestic abuse, and it might be helpful if I explain how this offence can be used to prosecute financial abuse. So one of the ways in which the new offence extends the ability of the criminal justice system to respond to domestic abuse is that it explicitly provides that abusers who engage in a course of abusive behaviour which makes their partner or ex-partner dependent on or subordinate to them, deprives them of or restricts their freedom of action, or regulates or monitors their day-to-day activities where a reasonable person would think that the behaviour is likely to cause them to suffer physical or psychological harm. In that case, they would be committing a criminal offence. And the definition of abusive behaviour is non-exhaustive. And in any individual case, it's open to the court to conclude that any behaviour which is intended to or is likely to cause the victim physical or psychological harm to the partner or the ex-partner can be included within the charge. And as such, the definition of abusive behaviour would, in any given case, include financial abuse of the kind described so well by members this evening. In any individual case, it is, of course, for Police Scotland and the Crown Office to investigate and prosecute cases under the new offence. And earlier this year, when speaking to the Daily Record, Detective Superintendent Gordon McCready from Police Scotland's Domestic Abuse Task Force said, "We have victims who have been made to account for their every movement. There are others who have had their money rationed, and none of these forms of abuse would have been prosecuted under previous legislation." End quotation. So we've worked closely with justice partners to ensure readiness for the Act's implementation. We provided £825,000 in funding to Police Scotland to support the development of training for 14,000 police officers and staff. Police Scotland have also developed a self-completion e-learning package on the new legislation, and that's been made available to 22,000 staff as well. The training for police officers is delivered by Safe Lives and recognises financial abuse as an interwoven feature of coercive control that often forms a key part of a pattern of controlling behaviours. And we're working with Safe Lives, building on the Police Scotland's Domestic Abuse Matters programme to develop an e-learning resource for professionals in housing, social work, health and schools, so that they have a shared understanding of the dynamics of domestic abuse, including financial abuse. Of course.
James Dornan.
Thank you. I appreciate the last bit you've just said there, but I mean, what serious work is going to be done to ensure that housing associations, DWP, local authorities understand the mechanisms when couples split up, and that the main person with the control of the finances tends to be the male and the one who gets the bills tends to be the woman?
Minister.
No, I think the member makes an important point there. So obviously I've just laid out the e-learning resource that the government's doing, but if it's amenable to the member, I will explore this further with officials, and I'll come back to the member specifically on that point at a later date. Of course, it's important that victims of controlling behaviour and psychological abuse understand what the change in the law means for them. And only if victims understand that a crime has been committed against them can perpetrators be held to account. So we undertook a public awareness campaign, as members will no doubt be aware, to coincide with the Act coming into force. And the core message of that campaign was that controlling behaviour is domestic abuse. And the campaign highlighted a number of examples of controlling behaviour. And one of the messages used in the campaign was that if your partner is controlling your finances, it is domestic abuse. Now, it will, of course, take time for us to see a full picture of how the new legislation is being used. However, I am encouraged by early indications of the use of the new offence. So management information published by Police Scotland shows that they have recorded 862 new crimes of domestic abuse in the first 6 months for which the new offence has been in force. And the Solicitor General informed Parliament last week that between the 1st of April to the 30th of November this year, the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service have prosecuted 539 charges under the new Domestic Abuse Scotland Act of 2018. And although most of the prosecutions are still going through the courts, there have been 101 convictions using the new offence. So there is more to do to protect victims of domestic abuse, that is clear. And that is why the First Minister announced in October that we will introduce a bill in the this session of the Parliament to create new protective barring orders to keep suspected perpetrators away from the home of someone who is at risk of abuse. And equally, the Scottish Government is committed to a fair benefits system as well that respects all. And that's why delivering split payments of universal credit is important, as this will give everyone access to an independent income and promote equality in the welfare system. A number of members have rightly highlighted the important role that financial institutions can play in supporting vulnerable people who are experiencing domestic abuse. And Safe Lives have teamed up with Surviving Economic Abuse, a UK-wide charity dedicated to tackling economic abuse, to develop and deliver training for the Royal Bank of Scotland Group staff to understand coercive control. And of course, there's a strong element of economic abuse within this, and I know that Margaret Mitchell raised this in her speech this evening. I understand that a number of major financial institutions have shown interest in taking action with regard to financial abuse and economic abuse more widely, working with support from Safe Lives of other specialist organisations, including Surviving Economic Abuse. So, Presiding Officer, this has been a very important debate this evening. It's clear that Scotland has moved a long way in recent years to improve the justice system's response to domestic abuse, including reform of the criminal law to better tackle financial abuse. But there is, of course, always more that can be done, and we will seek to do that to help protect people at risk of domestic abuse. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes the debate, and I close this meeting of Parliament.